So, I am a storyteller. I will be starting with a story about one boy, and my point together is for us to explore the patterns involved in his and other children's stories. I will focus today on the Netherlands, in part because I was asked to do so, but in part also because the Netherlands is for historians what New England is for American historians. New England is for European historians what New England is for American historians. If ever you want to investigate some question about early American colonial life, for example, you want to know about women's rights, or you want to know about land ownership, or you want to know about indemnification and how long somebody had to remain a servant, look at New England court records, because we New Englanders are a very litigious group, and we take everybody to court. And so there are court records about it. And the Dutch have the very same tradition. So you can find in Dutch legal records all manner of information, in this case relevant to whom did Jewish children belong after the war. The very same situation applied in Belgium, in Italy, in Poland, for goodness sakes, in France, but there isn't the same legal record. And I draw upon that legal record to bring you the information today. So is that all clear? Can you imagine all of that was just a sidebar? It's not even part of my 42 minutes. Sorry about the noise. It'll stop soon. There we go. So we start with Gerry Mok, the first name on your list. Gerry Mok was 3 years old when the Germans invaded the Netherlands. He was nearly 5 when a friend of his great aunt's took him from his home in Amsterdam to hide at her house in the city or town of Hoorn in February 1942. His parents were to come a day or two later, but they never arrived. They were deported and killed in Auschwitz. The house where Gerry was hidden also was raided, but he was saved by a Catholic family across the street that swooped him up in a game of hide and seek and hid him in the cupboard, and thus the Germans didn't find him. Gerry was subsequently moved about 15 times, but the original family with whom he hid, his foster parents, kept in contact with him wherever he went. After liberation, they came to fetch me from my last address and took me home, he remembered decades later. Gerry lived with that foster family after the war, and he went to school, and he waited for his parents to return. I expected them to come back, reasonable or not, and even notwithstanding the fact that people told me that probably my parents were dead. I expected my parents to come back. I expected everybody to come back, and no one came. It was Gerry Mok's historical fate to be one of the 3,512 Jewish children hidden in the Netherlands who were registered as war foster children. Sidebar, there were many others, but this number were registered after the war. They were registered as war foster children, or on your list, oorlogspleegkinderen. This is after the war. And the question that arose was, to whom did they now belong? Now that problem had begun to plague resistors dedicated to the rescue of Jewish children long before the end of the war. Led by Gesine van der Molen, a severely Calvinist, strong-willed lawyer. Sidebar, she really was a very good thinker, but she must have been a pain in the neck. They drafted a law pertaining to war foster children, which called for the establishment of a special guardian commission called OPECA. On your list, OPK, OPECA. OPECA was to have a central office and a government budget to, and now I'm quoting from the legislation, to continue and bring to a close work done during the occupation through underground means for the social welfare of children threatened by the enemy. Not Jewish children, but children threatened by the enemy. The commission was to be granted guardianship of all war foster children, quote, whose parents or guardians have not registered at the OPECA office within 1 month of the publication of the law. Sidebar again, and what parents would not turn up to register? Concentration camp survivors who were far away, ill, and unable to get to the Netherlands within 30 days. So, back to main storyline. The commission would be composed of the members of the underground child rescue groups that had helped children during the war. The authors of this law clearly believed that it was they and not any Jewish community authority or civil welfare child bureaucracy. It was they who knew what was best for the children, because it was they who knew intimately the conditions under which the youngsters had lived for the past 3 years, and because it was they who had risked their lives on behalf of those children too. Indeed, the child rescue workers who wrote the bill did not think that hidden children's family members, or in certain cases, the parents themselves, were so competent to act in the children's best interests as they themselves were. Again, quote, parents whose children are under the guardianship of OPECA will have their parental authority returned to them by a judge when they are physically, spiritually, and socially capable of exercising that authority over the children. Most particularly, the authors of the proposed law wanted to erase the differentiation between Jewish and Christian Dutch citizens. They refused, they said, to continue to distinguish between Jews and non-Jews as the Germans had. Their goal was to come to a true melting together. Sidebar, so you're getting the picture. Parents could not reclaim not even parents could reclaim their children. They had to prove to a judge that they were capable of being parents. And the second was that the OPECA refused to distinguish between Jews and Christian Dutch people. You're with me so far? Okay. But by refusing to distinguish, they also refused to differentiate. Treating all Dutch citizens equally, they ignored the special assaults their Jewish compatriots had endured, and thus they ignored their Jewish compatriots' special needs. The Netherlands was liberated on May 8, 1945, and a few days later, the OPECA Commission held a meeting to establish guidelines for the reunification of children with their biological families. Their goal, they said, was to prevent disturbing or shocking changes for the child, to maintain a stable environment for the child, in short, for the child's own good, close relatives were not to be given the current address of the children they sought to find, and parents' requests would be judged individually on a case-by-case basis. So that's what OPECA was doing. At the same time, a newly reconstituted Jewish communal authority, and you can imagine that this reconstituted Jewish authority is composed of displaced, disillusioned, disaffected survivors, right? Who else is around? So it's called the Jewish Coordinating Committee, or JCC, I think on your list. The JCC established its own Jewish Guardianship Association, which they called Ezrat Hayeled, to help the child. The positions of the JCC and the OPECA were in direct contradiction. The JCC wanted Jewish orphans to be returned to the authority of Jewish communal bodies, as would have been the case before the war, when Protestants looked after Protestants and Catholics looked after Catholics and Jews looked after Jews. The JCC wanted to rebuild the Jewish community. The OPECA, by contrast, insisted the children remain where they were. They may or may not be returned to their parents. They certainly should not be given to family members, and on no conditions were they to be turned over to the authority of the Jewish community. Both parties were convinced that the program they advocated was in the best interest of the child. In fact, of course, while the programs they advocated may or may not have been in the best interest of the child, they certainly were in the best interest of their own ideologies. Despite the attempts of the JCC to enlist the sympathy of the Dutch government, the OPECA was in fact written into law by royal decree in August 1945. Framed by the perspective of the child rescue workers, the law did not recognize either the needs or the sensibilities of the Jewish community. The OPECA, now an officially established body with 25 members, of whom 10, a minority, were Jews, gained guardianship over the orphans. And this law triggered a bitter 4-year dispute that centered around the claims of the Jewish community versus those of OPECA and the Gentile foster parents. An article published in the leftist newspaper De Groene Amsterdammer shortly thereafter articulated the position of the Jewish community. The author, Caroline Eitje, pleaded for the return of the orphans to the community. She was sympathetic to the foster parents, and she acknowledged that many of them truly loved their the Jewish children they had raised. But she pointed out these children had been entrusted to them, and what is entrusted must be returned. The issue, she argued, was straightforward. What community can, with impunity, give up its young? What community can give up the next generation that embodies its future? It would be an enormous disaster, she wrote, for that small remnant of Dutch Jews, which consists mainly of older men and women. That was the reason why the Jewish community must demand its younger sons and daughters, and why they said they cannot make any concession on this point. In an interview, Gesine van der Molen presented her position to the general public. Our commission considers the issue a Dutch affair, which must be solved in a national Dutch manner. Her plan, she said, would be to act in accordance with what the parents would have wanted. The wish of the parents comes first. This always will be respected. But often this is not known, and so we must go on probabilities. Sounds reasonable, right? But the weakness of her plan depended upon the interpretation. Whose interpretation? And how would this interpretation come of the wishes of the parents? Van der Molen sought to divine how the parents would have brought up their children by assessing their Jewishness. But her scale of Jewishness was framed by her Calvinist idea of what a Jew does to be a good Jew, not necessarily what a Jew feels she does to be a good Jew. Earnest and well-meaning but perfectly ridiculous investigations were conducted to determine the degree of Jewish observance and therefore the degree of Jewish identity and therefore the presumed child-rearing practices and education plans of the parents for their children. And this is where the court records are great. Despite the efforts of the Jewish minority on the commission to educate the Gentile majority about the meaning and importance of Jewish culture as well as Jewish observance, the Gentiles ignored and remained ignorant. The majority argued, for instance, that the parents were not really Jewish because they did not keep a kosher home, or because they had worked on Saturdays. Perhaps, the Jewish majority argued, the parents had indeed married in synagogue, but only to satisfy their own parents. And maybe they belonged to the Jewish community not because they believed, but just because it was a habit. In case after case, they denied a so-called positive Jewish environment, that was their language, in the home of the child's parents and recommended that the child remain with the foster parents. You're with me? Okay. In one instance, a judge ruled that even though the father had attended synagogue regularly and the parents had kept a kosher home, they obviously did not have a Jewish way of life because their little girl had eaten non-kosher cookies in a neighbor's house next door. In another case, the judge ignored the testimony of 3 women survivors of Auschwitz who attested to the wishes of little Hani Murpurgo's mother. Before her death in Auschwitz, Hani Murpurgo's mother, these 3 witnesses said, had asked them that if they survived and returned to the Netherlands, please make sure my daughter receive a Jewish education. The judge found that under those conditions of Auschwitz, the woman was incapable of thinking logically. Holding fast to the concept of the best interest of the child and to their conviction that to separate a child from wartime foster parents would cause grave psychological harm, OPK supported the explicit political goal of assimilation. and the implicit religious agenda of saving souls. The majority operated on the a priori assumption that dual loyalties were impossible. All Dutch citizens should be simply and solely Dutch. And they operated on the assumption that the best thing that can happen to a Jew is to become a Christian. The JCC and the Jews on the OPK Commission understood this all too well, and the Jewish members of the commission walked out. A year and a half after the liberation of the Netherlands, the government finally and at long last considered the wishes of its Jewish citizens on the issue. OPK was ordered to cooperate with Ezrat HaYeled, and then the Jewish members of the OPK Commission withdrew their resignation and rejoined the commission. Court battles continued to be waged about the detrimental psychological effects of removing a child from the foster home. But the Jewish minority now had clearer guidelines to which they could refer, and they had a more secure legal foundation for their case. It was so secure, in fact, that it changed Cherimok's life irrevocably. Remember Cherimok? Right. My foster parents were asked whether they would mind if, for a Jewish holiday, I would be in Jewish surroundings, to which they said, "Oh, of course, we would not mind at all. He is a Jewish child," and so on. This is all from Cherimok. So I went to several parties. One day, I went to a Hanukkah party, and my foster parents came to fetch me. But it turned out it was an Aliyah Bet group. This is a group which organized illegal emigration to Palestine. And they came to fetch me, but they did not get me. So I became a legal affair and a court affair. And in the end, I was put into the Jewish orphanage. The court took the decision that I should go to that orphanage and stay there until I was 21, which I did. We have heard about the adults' positions on the subject of the best interest of the Oorlogspleegkind, but we have heard very little from the children themselves. If this were the only history to be told, if this were the only way to think about and to write history, then the controversy over the war foster children in the Netherlands would tell us a great deal about how adults use children to further their own projects, whatever they may be. And it would lay bare the divisions within Dutch society. But the history of the very public fight by adults over the war foster children will not tell us anything about the children themselves. It is they, and only they, who can tell us what it meant to have been in hiding, to have waited, if they were old enough to remember, for their parents, to have been disappointed, as Cherimok was, or to have been reunited with that memory in the flesh. Much of the discussion about the war foster children was, and in different iterations still is, rooted in the myth that Jewish children had become an integral part of the foster family. That, as the psychoanalysts Joseph Goldstein, Anna Freud, and Al Solnit put it in their book, Beyond the Best Interest of the Child, they, and now I'm quoting these psychoanalysts, those children had grown intimately into the families of their foster parents. And it's true, many children did develop close relationships. But that does not mean that they necessarily felt utterly at home there. And many other children did not have warm ties at all. Remember, it's wartime Netherlands. Children were sent to people who were willing to take them and who were trusted not to betray them. During the war and in the midst of the Shoah, considerations of a happy family or a stable home were superfluous. So we're not talking about a true adoption. Nazism, altruism, mostly, greed, sometimes, and need brought the children together with these foster families. Very, very young children, newborn to the first or second year of life, who were in hiding but living visibly, so not like Anna Frank in an attic, but living visibly, may have fit in seamlessly with their new families. But even 3-year-olds, even if they could live openly with people who loved them, felt the burden to adapt. Which means, of course, that they were not at home. Max Arian. Max Arian was not yet 3 years old when he was taken from Amsterdam to a temporary address in the south of the Netherlands. I think I learned a lot there that has to do with the whole building of my character. I learned to be silent, not to sit near a window, to be sweet, to be a nice little child. Now, shortly thereafter, Max was moved to the Michaels family, where he was very much loved. But even there, he molded himself into a boy who would be little trouble or bother. And as he said, and therefore allowed to stay. So there was constant pressure to adjust, adapt, conform. As Gerry Mok explained, I always had the feeling that I was not behaving as if I were myself, but as if I were somebody else. I took my new identity and I tried to live in that new identity. Max, Arian, and Gerry Mok lived in families who were fond of them. Other children did not. And it was not easy to be in hiding, whether openly passing as a Gentile or hidden from view. The children were hard-pressed, safe for the moment, but always in that trap of gratitude and self-abnegation. They lived with people whom they felt obliged to please and towards whom they were beholden, because they, the Gentile adults, allowed the children to live, because the Gentile adults risked their lives also, because they too lived outside the law. For those Jewish children who were old enough to remember, the memory alone of family life was sometimes a source of strength and solace. Throughout the war, they preserved the hope or dream that someday the family would be reunited. In some kind of vague or inchoate way, they presumed that when the war was over, they would resume their family life and the old structures and certainties would be restored. They never were, of course. Gerry Mok is just one of the thousands of Jewish orphans who had to accept and assimilate the loss of their parents after the war. Fewer children were united, as was Max Arian, with one or both parents. But for no one did the past return as it had been. And adjustment was not easy for anyone. Gerry and Max had very different experiences after the war. Gerry was sent to the Jewish orphanage, Max was returned to his mother and grandmother. But there are commonalities, and a certain pattern emerges from their histories. First, and this is pretty obvious, they both had difficulties. What is not so obvious, but equally true, is that the decisions and the moves and the feelings and adjustments taken immediately after the war were only temporary. The Oorlogspleegkinderen legislation that was passed and the battles that ensued reflected the paradigms of legal thinking, the need in law to simplify issues, to create clarity. In the case of these children, that clarity may have been more destructive than constructive. So in law, it's either or, but in life, it's not always either or. It's sometimes and. So this structure of either or choices, either the foster parents or the parents, either the foster parents or the extended family, either the foster parents or the Jewish community, that was a contradiction of the real needs of the child. Chedi Mok was attracted to the Jewish community, and he was attached to his foster family. He sensed the duality when he was young, and as he grew older, he understood it better. The Aliyah Bet group that kidnapped him in 1947 and urged him to emigrate to Palestine, well, his foster parents did not want him to leave them or to leave the country. So should he stay or should he go? So I had this mixed feeling of, on one hand, nice that finally people spoke my own language, used my own words, could understand my jokes, which was really important. So I didn't want to go, but on the other hand, I was very much attracted by the whole thing of Judaism and Jewish atmosphere. So I didn't know what I wanted. All I knew was that I wanted to stay with my foster family. But on the other hand, I didn't want to stay with that family because I knew that it was not home. It was a different social atmosphere, a different social background. In the end, Chedi knew he was, as he said, a stranger in the house. I knew I belonged somewhere, and that somewhere didn't exist anymore. Max, by contrast, was not faced with that either-or decision, not at the time nor later. And notwithstanding his own considerable difficulties, he negotiated the transition with greater ease than Chedi had. In August 1944, his foster parents received a letter from Mrs. Aryan, Max's mother, and they began to prepare the by then 4.5-year-old for his mother's return. One day, his mother came by a hired car. The car stopped. This is Max speaking. The car stopped and a lady got out. That's what I remember. And the rest is the story of my foster father. He said he looked out of the window and he saw my mother getting out of the car. And she just picked me out of that whole crowd of children playing in the street. My mother asked him later on, "Why did you give Max back to me so easily?" And my foster father said, "When you picked out Max from all those children, of course we knew that you were the mother of Max. It couldn't be otherwise." Max left with his mother, but she promised that they would return as soon as possible for a few days, and she kept her word. Even after they returned to Amsterdam, she sent her son to his wartime foster family in the South, and she herself visited many times. The Catholic family in Limburg and the Jewish biological family in Amsterdam were linked through Max, and those ties were never cut. In my memory, I was there on Easter and on Christmas, always on Christmas, and some of the summer holidays too when I was young. I did that even when I was a university student for 15 years, and I was always very happy there. Sidebar, when I recorded this history, Max's wife came in just around this part, and she said, "What are you talking about through your university years? We just went last summer for the whole summer." And she turned to me and she said, "Guess where my honeymoon was?" So this was not an either-or proposition. Max had two families, one Catholic, one Jewish, one in the country, one in the city. As he grew older, he realized that his mother's ideas about his future and his place in society were different than his foster parents. For instance, she assumed he would go to university. They didn't even contemplate it. He also came to recognize that his own ideas, his own interests were closer to those of his mother and surviving relatives rather than his foster parents. But his relationship with them, and I quote him now, always stayed very, very close and very good. I was a member of that family. I went to their weddings and to their funerals. Max Arian grew up to become a well-known and highly respected editor and journalist for the left-wing Die Groene. He married and he became a father and grandfather. And he maintained that richness of his youth in his social vision of respect and tolerance. Interestingly, Gerry Mock also became a journalist. He became the political editor of the conservative magazine Elsevier. He too married and became a father and a grandfather. He translated the either-or choices of his past into his profoundly political vision of contemporary life. So a little wrap-up. The history of children like Gerry and Mock reveal, I think with clarity, that the oorlogspleegkind controversy was over the children, but it was not about them. There were two issues at stake for the adults. The first is that ever unresolved balancing of the collective versus the individual good. What is best for the Jewish community was best for the Jewish child. What was best for the New Netherlands is best for the foster child. The second is the equally eternal problem of the hegemony of the dominant culture. Indeed, the children were called war foster children, oorlogspleegkinderen. They were not called war orphans. They were seen from the perspective of the Gentiles who took them in, not from their own situation of loss and devastation. Analysis of the history of the children does more than that. Assessing the 70-year post-war history of now elderly children, such as Gerry and Max, two patterns emerge. And the first is that when it comes to children, every plan, every program, and every solution is marked for obsolescence. The needs of a 4-year-old are different from what that same child will need when she is 14. And understanding that problem from the children's perspective gets to the heart of the question of identity. Are they who they think they are, or are they who society thinks they are? For children, growing and evolving, the solutions will constantly change. And the second pattern that emerged is that one way or another, each child has integrated his or her pre-war and wartime experiences with his or her post-war life. There was no caesura in 1945. That's before, this is after. And it is our job to be looking at those continuities.